hit record so that those that can't join us this evening can get the recording afterwards and watch it. But thank you and welcome to this Prism Sheep Animal Health webinar this evening. I had a few technical issues before tonight, so hopefully you can't hear the music in the background here, but I'm actually not sat at home. I'm sat in the cafe at the gym because that's the only way I could get internet this evening. But we worked around it and hopefully you guys won't have any technical issues, especially Tim. So our presenter this evening is Tim Potter, a well-known beef and sheep vet. If Tim doesn't know it, it probably isn't worth knowing. He managed to answer all the questions when we did the beef one, and it really is an insight of knowledge. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Tim to talk through his presentation. But if anyone wants to ask any questions as we're going through, if you have got any background noise your end, then just put mute on. But if you want to ask a question, use the raise the hand bit at the top of the screen. There's the little hand, or type something in the chat, and we can intercept Tim at any point with questions there. I'll just bring you in, obviously, if you raise your hand. So over to you, Tim.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction, Katie. That isn't a challenge to try and flummox me with questions. But yeah, today is much more about just a bit of a discussion. And in terms of the topic, let me just share my slides. As I said, Katie, if you're happy to monitor for people sticking their hands up, and then we can discuss as we go through. Let me share my screen. Right. Hopefully, can everyone see that?
Yep.
Perfect. My brief for this evening was to very much talk about animal health and sustainability, and I think that's very much the focus of today. So we're not going to talk a huge amount about soils or carbon or anything like that. I think it's about, I come at this very much from the animal health and veterinary perspective, and I think it's about understanding how actually probably all we're doing is repackaging some of the targets and some of the things that we've been aiming for in terms of efficiency, high welfare systems, for however long we've been farming, actually fit very much in with the sustainability piece. And it's not getting intimidated by that and just going, well, actually, if we start looking at how do I promote higher standards of health, higher standards of welfare, and that productivity, actually developing those efficient systems is going to be really key for our systems being sustainable. Because whatever we do, actually, if we bring in efficiency, that is going to help us improve our sort of what we look like in terms of environmental impact through whatever metrics we choose to use. And I suppose if we look at it, if we can get improved efficiency, improve better the land use that we are using, we reduce the animal population, and so therefore that then has a reduction on that enteric methane. So we reduce emissions that way. We reduce the challenge we have around manure production and the sort of runoff that comes off from that point of view. And if we can get to a system where we are making best use of the available feeds, we can potentially look at sort of how do we reduce that need for feed production, making best use of crops that are growing in our local areas, or sort of at least our local geography, rather than necessarily having to bring in additional sort of supplementary feeds. We're all working in that way where actually we are making our systems much more sustainable. So it's not, this talk is very much not about me looking about how do I reduce methane coming out of my ewes and my lambs. It is about us, how do I make my systems much more efficient? So we can almost sort of, that's where we're going through this. So my focus today is going to be literally, it's a very broad topic. So I make no apology for the fact that we're not going to go into a huge amount of depth on specific disease issues. We just simply don't have time, and we can answer specific questions if they come up. But ultimately, hey, we could build into this going sustainable parasite control fits in as a massive topic within this, but that would be an entire lecture on its own. In the same way, we could do a whole piece on lamb survival, a whole piece on lameness. This is about how do you look at your system, think about how you are making efficiencies, how do you work with your teams, with your advisors, with your vets to make sure that you are producing the most efficient system, because that is how you are going to ensure that your system is sustainable. So I suppose if we look at that sort of livestock strategies to decarbonize meat production, because that's where we're sort of really focused. We've sort of, everyone's gone down the line of sort of carbon footprinting, and sort of very much of where this sort of setup fits in is sort of going, right, understanding all the inputs that go into producing that meat. If we look across all livestock, there are sort of that kind of, that strategy sits there where if we want to make the system much more efficient, how do we improve reproductive efficiency? How do we improve daily live weight gain? Look at how do we improve meat and egg yield, so taking it all the way through that lifetime of production. So it's not just about, right, how do I get that lamb on the ground, it's how do I get that animal as quickly as possible to where it needs to be for slaughter, but when we get it to that point, how is it most efficient, and does it fit the spec that's required? It's the sort of least waste possible. And central to that, and that's where I come in as the sort of almost the veterinary perspective within this presentation, and that's very much the focus for tonight, is going, right, we want to improve health, because whatever disease we put out there, we can turn around and say ultimately that disease will have an impact on production. It could be, hey, that individual animal that we are losing, so that makes our system much less efficient. But we could also have some of these diseases that will have a sort of wider ranging impact in terms of that sort of subclinical impact across an entire group. So it's thinking about how do we control those as well. We want to improve feed efficiency. And if we look specifically at the sort of the lamb sector, rather than just the whole holistic sort of livestock thing, where do we sit? We probably want to focus on reducing mortality. So thinking about, well, actually, if I'm getting this lamb crop, if I'm delivering that increased reproductive efficiency, I'm delivering those lambs getting used in lamb, how am I then ensuring the maximum number of those go through and reach their target, be that as future replacements for the flock, or as animals going into the food chain. We can reduce that age at slaughter and we can get them through quicker, then, and we're promoting the higher growth rates. Ultimately, again, we can start balancing that with being much more efficient. We have to look at that in terms of making sure that actually we sort of don't tip the other way a little bit in terms of what we are, the feeds that are coming in, but so that there's a bit of a seesaw there in terms of balancing it. And that's where ultimately we think about having to try and improve that pasture use efficiency, because I think that's where the sheep industry as a whole sits, sort of almost has that advantage in terms of where we're at in terms of making much better use of sort of some of those extensively grazed systems, and being able to actually make better use of pasture that actually isn't suited to other species or the sort of crop-based systems. So ultimately, I think that's today's focus is very much upon that health piece, but it's about you thinking about how do you look at your system, how are you probably measuring to manage. I don't want to be here sort of preaching about data and things, but it's about making sure data works for you, because I think it's all we can get guilty of. People tell us to record things, but it's then asking, right, what's the so what's the actionable insight that data gives me, that enables me to take steps to improve my system, and through those improvements is where we are going to get those efficiencies and how we drive the systems to be much more sustainable. And in terms of sort of measuring to manage, I suppose it's thinking about, and all of you, if we went around the room, would probably have some KPIs that you're, so key performance indicators that you're working to. You'll all have access to data in some form, and some people are very data focused and embrace it and make through lots of different sources. Other people are much sort of less less built that way, and so less focused on it. But I think understanding the system in terms of that sustainability piece is going to be really key. It's about how can I make a system more efficient if I don't know what I'm doing. And I think as we go into changes that we're seeing in terms of subsidies and all those kind of things, actually understanding the cost of production is going to be really key, and sort of some key things that you to look at in terms of your performance, reviewing that, and then starting to think about, right, setting targets about what you want to do in terms of improving it. Because I can sit here listing off all these figures, and some of this will be old hat to most of you, but actually it's then going, right, what am I doing with that? What am I going to do about it? What triggers does it set in terms of my actions if I am not hitting where I want to be? And hey, we've got the base number is going to be your flock size, so number of ewes and number of rams, and so that's going to be your base piece of data. And I think that's going to be that one thing. Just having that inventory helps you sort of understand, and is going to be your base figure for any of the sort of later figures that we're going to look at, because it's going to be, that's what we ultimately divide anything by. We think about then moving on, it's going to be, right, well, actually, what have we got in terms of rearing percentages? How are we, what number of lambs are being sold, retained, number of lambs going to the top? And I suppose that's where we start really getting into that efficiency piece. And it provides you with that annual baseline. So having it year on year allows you to sort of, gives you an idea of where you're sat. And absolutely, most of you will have these off the top of your head, but it is just having it there and sort of being able to discuss those and sort of think about how you review them and where your targets sit as what you're trying to achieve. Because hey, when you start thinking about your feed efficiency, when you start thinking about what your breeding programs are looking for, or number of replacements you're wanting to keep, or what you're going to do about your culling, having that there, having a plan, communicating that amongst the rest of the team is going to be really important. We'll have the scanning data. And I suppose that sort of then is that first piece of information we really have about how successful our breeding has been, and is that good sort of, this is your how many lambs are expected, and then that provides a baseline that we go, right, if I take I've got my lambing percentage, it's then going, right, when I then get to lambing time and the end of that period, it's going, right, where have I got to? What have I got in terms of losses at during that period? Because understanding the losses and where they occur is then crucial to thinking about how do you improve systems. Because you sort of go, right, if you're sat there going, right, actually what I want to do is I want to have more lambs on the ground, I want to rear more lambs, the first thing you have to do is like, right, that's great, and that's a perfect aspiration to have, but we then need to understand where is the opportunity for the improvements to happen. So where are the current losses? And so it's thinking about, right, are they happening because we're just not getting the percentage in lamb at the first point, so we're not scanning out to where we want them to be, or are we getting that data, that figure where we want it to be, but then we're subsequently losing it, be that through abortions, reabsorptions, things like that. So it then sort of gets you to start targeting where your interventions are going to be, because everyone's farm is going to be different, everyone's risk factors are going to be different. So it's almost thinking about, we always look at the sheep in a sort of that calendar year, and actually I think that's a sort of great way of looking at it and go, right, if I look through this stepwise process as I go through the year, where have I got the biggest point of attrition in terms of numbers? Where have I got that biggest opportunity in terms of potentially saving more lambs, or that potential to intervene to increase the lamb crop at that point, or increase growth rates? But it's a sort of, we can be very, there's no one solution that's going to go, right, I press this button, I give this drug that is going to give, right, this is going to boost your production across the board. It's about us thinking about targeted things in certain points. And I could sit here and we can go on about different causes of abortion, but actually, yeah, there are good vaccines out there, and subject to availability, of course. But what we end up with is it's like, right, I can sell you vaccines as a vet, and you can go, right, and it's a belt and braces approach, and we want to prevent it. But actually, if that's not you're not having an issue with abortions and you're not having issues with losses, it's a worthwhile sort of potential sort of preventative measure. But are you suddenly going to see a massive uptick in the terms of numbers of lambs that are coming through? No. So it's about understanding where your investment is going to be to actually sort of yield what you want. We can look at the number of empty ewes at scanning, and then sort of suppose that's where we start getting into those vaccinations, and we go, right, okay, well, actually, what is going on that there's potentially causing abortions, stillbirth, reabsorption, and then overall lamb losses. So what are we doing in terms of losses? But if we take it to the next step, it's going right, thinking about where you want to get to. And I think this table here is from a recent paper sort of that Matt Blythe, Leslie Sudsbings and Philippa Page put out there in the veterinary sector. And actually, I think it's a really nice overview of where some of the bits of data allow you to start really sort of drilling down and having sort of that opportunity to really sort of focus on specific points. So if you look through your system, and perhaps that's your take home for today, is going right, look through your system and start thinking about where it is that you really want to improve. And it's a sort of, because we'd all go right, I want to make more money, I want to make my system more efficient. It's then going right, which part of my system is the currently almost that rate determining step? Which part of it is the bit where there's the most opportunity for the least amount of investment for me to get an improvement? And sort of starting to think through some of those bits of information that you may have to hand, or with a bit more sort of just thinking about how you record it or thinking about what you collect, allows you to address that. So we can sort of ultimately, we have targets for our scanning, and sort of that's a useful starting point. We can then start going and go right, where are we going to fit with terms of sort of that rearing percentage, and that's, yeah, we start looking at the overall piece. That's going to be right, what is it that you end up selling at the end of the day? So that tally, and that sort of right, what is the end check that we get from lamb sales? But actually, if you want to start really understanding where your problem is, it's going to think about right, okay, let's look at starting to break that rearing period down into specific time periods. So thinking about rearing percent up to sort of 8 weeks, up to weaning, sort of at the end of the season. So it could be over a period of the sort of the animal's life, or it could be a period just in terms of the time period in terms of months, so that you can sort of understand what time of year that you have problems. Barren rates again will be a sort of that sort of kickstart for people to start looking at sort of what's going on in terms of those animals actually getting in lamb, and work with your vets. As often like a lot of the vaccine companies put out subsidies each year in terms of vaccinations. Take advantage of those. So there's subsidized blood samples that are available for Barren new checks, for and those kind of opportunities that sort of allow you to access information to screen for some of the key sort of contagious diseases, that actually just you understanding what's going on, what's circulating in your flock, has there been any change in that? Because then at least it highlights where there's been opportunity for you to increase efficiencies and to increase opportunity. Lamb mortality, again, it's thinking about, we can look at it as an overall piece. So, hey, this is the number of lambs I had born alive, to then sort of taking it right to the end bit. So going right, number of lambs born to versus number of lambs sold. That's great. Gives you a starting point. But then think about, if we start dividing that into smaller chunks and having it sort of looking at it as you go through the period, it allows you to start focusing down on where your opportunities are to increase efficiency. So thinking about potentially, it's say from birth to turnout, from turnout to weaning, after weaning. So because if we start knowing where that is and where those challenges come, we can then start being really targeted about what we do to investigate those. Because, hey, if you don't have a problem with getting live lambs on the ground, but you're losing them all sort of after weaning, it's a sort of right, well, that's where we need to focus our efforts going forward. It's also thinking about that, actually, if I break this into chunks and I'm checking in on my performance as I go through the season, it's not just getting to the end of the season in terms of the end of growing, realizing that, hey, summing it up there, it's going right, well, actually, if we know that we've got higher losses, we can start addressing those. And it's also thinking about, I think there is sometimes something to be said for reviewing things in a timely manner. So actually looking at your lambing percentage, looking at sort of your lamb mortalities immediately post lambing. And I know everyone's exhausted and there's other things going on, but actually having that kind of, if we look at any other industry, we look at any other sort of way people work, people talk about having wash-up meetings, and actually it's the time at the end of lambing to sort of review what went well, what went badly, and how do I actually start really improving. And then we've got the things that very familiar with things like body condition scoring. So thinking about, right, we may just do a targeted number at certain periods, but we might then also do it as specific groups, or we do it for all use. And again, it's a sort of, we can take it to extremes and have everything scored, but it's going to be right. What does the data allow you to do it? And sort of don't be make sure you're using the data, sharing it with your advisors, sharing it with your teams and things, that and actually you're then using it to make decisions, because data ultimately for data's sake isn't very efficient. It's about, it only becomes efficient and useful if you then use it to make a decision about being able to do an intervention. So using your body condition scores to go, right, well, actually, that's going to drive when I am going to potentially do my weaning weight, do my weanings, or potentially look at actually how do I potentially build in supplementary feeding if required, or it's going to drive me to start thinking about how do I sort of look at potential diagnostics or fecal egg counts or things like that. So it is about using that, having the data there, collect it, use it, and then use that to improve efficiencies in your system. And as I said before, everyone is going to have a different system. So it's what are the challenges specific to your farm? What are the risk factors? Everyone will have a slightly different way of working. They'll have a slightly different set up in terms of numbers, in breeds, what they're doing in terms of pasture management, what they're doing in terms of lambing management. And so you understanding when that disease occurs. So thinking about, right, when am I losing lambs? So are they lost between TUP and scanning? So thinking about what's going on in terms of barren animals. So that then points you towards potentially issues with nutrition. It may be that you're looking at terms of sort of things about what's going on in terms of abortions, but also metabolic diseases. But actually, if we then look at it and go, right, well, actually, we scanned out well, we got decent number of animals lambed through, and we had a decent number of lambs born. If we're then having losses after that, you then go, well, actually, that is then our focus area, isn't it? It's moving away from, there's not a huge amount of point us sort of putting sway in a lot of vaccines that we give prior to for abortion that's going to cause sort of to solve our issues later on. So it's making sure we're focusing on where our opportunity is. So large losses after birth, we're going to start thinking more about what's going on in terms of that hygiene. And there will be things outside our control. We started today in sort of in the waiting room chatting about the weather and sort of the inclement things like that. And there will always be that kind of impact of those things that we can't control. But there are things that we can control. So it is thinking about, right, don't just sort of go, all right, yeah, we had bad weather, so that's what's caused it. And it's, yeah, that will cause a certain amount, but it's then going, right, I can't control that bit, but how can I improve the other bits around it? So things that if we're seeing largely after birth, think about hygiene, colostrum management, and sort of that postnatal care. And then as we go through that growing period, thinking on from there as well. Highlight from a sort of funding opportunities and things out there. Hopefully you're all aware of the animal health and welfare pathway. These are sort of one of the schemes that's been sort of set up to help drive efficiencies within the within the sector. They are currently providing funding for sort of vets to come out and sort of undertake a sheep review with you. It will involve some diagnostic testing, and for the sheep sector, they have stipulated that that's around sort of parasiticides and sort of drench testing efficiency. But it's an opportunity for you to go through the data, review what you're currently doing, think about your current protocols, and ultimately they're there to provide tailored health screening to address a range of endemic diseases. As I say, they've highlighted parasites, and that's where the diagnostic testing is. But ultimately, they're also interested in mastitis, in lameness, in abortions, and it should be very much about you reviewing that system and going, right, if I've got that data, where is it I have the opportunity to bring about changes? So I would encourage you to contact your vets and take advantage of that. As I say, the focus is very much around lameness, improving that use sustainability, and I think we're also going to see that sort of increased sort of movement on sort of what do we do around sort of that pain management around castration and tail docking, and sort of that trying to promote the sort of welfare around that. If we take it back to animal health, which is ultimately where I sort of sit very much and focus as a vet, is animal health and disease. It's a sort of complex interaction, and so there's certainly some diseases are more complex than others, but ultimately we have the animal there, and things are going to impact on that animal's health. It's going to have it on its susceptibility to disease. It's exactly the same as you or me when we're tired. If we're working too hard, we sort of go out and party too hard during Christmas time. However it is, we can end up suppressing our immune system because we're just not looking after ourselves, and nutrition can impact on that, stress can impact on that, and animals are no different. So we have the animal there, and it's a sort of its immunity, and we can do things to boost it. So where vaccines can come in. We can also if we look at the younger animals coming through, that's where the importance of colostrum comes in. We are providing that immunity to the animal to sort of fight off disease. And then that animal then interacts with the disease causing organism, so the pathogen, and it's whether or not that pathogen is there in such quantity that it's going to cause disease. So that's going to be, how do we think about what's in the sort of being transmitted in the animals around it? Is it coming into our flock? Is there a breakdown in biosecurity? Is it there in such high quantities? So if hygiene is at poor level, we could have an animal that has got all the colostrum in the world. We're sort of feeding it well, we're looking after it, but actually if we're putting it into a really dirty environment, we can have such an overwhelming sort of pathogen load that we sort of overcome and sort of tip the seesaw to a point where actually the pathogen just effectively overwhelms the animal's disease resilience. So we have to look at disease control as this sort of tripartite piece, where we're boosting immunity of the animal, either sort of passively and sort of nutrition, minimizing stress. We are trying to control exposure from the pathogen, so trying to keep it out. So in terms of sort of biosecurity and stopping it getting in there, looking at how do we limit spread, and we want to make sure our environment is fit for purpose. So we are providing animals the shelter, so they're avoiding that stress that they will potentially lead them more susceptible to disease, or we're in a situation where that environment isn't the risk factor to the disease. So if we're keeping that environment clean, or we're making sure our sheds are properly disinfected before we start lambing, we're going into a clean environment, and then we minimize that disease exposure. So biosecurity is never the sexy topic to talk about, but I think it's a key thing to think about, and in terms of, as you create that efficient flock, is all right, how do I protect those animals from disease? And biosecurity encompasses all procedures used to prevent the introduction and spread of disease. And I think if any of you have ever been onto a pig or poultry farm, I think the attitude, certainly when you go onto sort of some of the very large commercial pig and poultry units, into terms of biosecurity, is very different from how we would sort of approach it in the ruminant sector. And we could probably learn something from that. Yes, it does mean that ultimately those farms are much less approachable. But hey, as a vet, if I've got clients and I'm going onto some of these poultry units, I will be showering in, showering out, or it's a sort of, we are properly making sure we're not bringing pathogens into those units. But that is probably not going to be necessarily practical on all your farms, but actually whatever we can do to limit or reduce that exposure, it's not almost an all or nothing thing. I think that's how some people view it. It's like, well, if I can't do it, I'm not going to do anything. But it's all about risk. So if you are making sure that you are cleaning your boots if you go off and go to another farm, you're going to reduce the risk of that instance bringing something in the same way, making sure that visitors to your flock are clean. In terms of, if you're borrowing equipment, if you can avoid it in the first place, that's great. But if you are having to bother, making sure it's clean, and thinking about your sourcing of animals, it's sort of, don't view it as I can't have a totally closed sort of enclosed block that is totally immune to disease coming in, therefore I'm not going to do anything about it. Every little thing that you can do will reduce that potential risk of disease coming in. But it's also there to think about how do we control the spread of disease within a population. So very much think about how your actions will impact on that disease spread. So think about if you're looking at contagious causes of lameness, if we're looking at contagious things like mastitis, think about how is it we are isolating animals to prevent the spread to the rest of the flock. And there are lots of different potential routes of transmission, and they will vary depending on what diseases we're talking about. And this is a very sort of exhaustive list here about sort of we see some that are airborne, we see some of those that are coughed up into droplets that are then transmitted on equipment or on the sort of surface, and we can actually act ourselves as sort of almost the fomite, so that sort of these objects that are then sort of transmitting disease from one animal to another. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where we've got blue tongue detected again over in the southeast, and that's sort of come in through the vectors and sort of generally sort of spread through the midges, but that can also be spread through sort of actions of ourselves, so needle reuse and sort of vaccinations and things like that. So it is thinking about what we are doing in terms of controlling our disease transmission and sort of what we can do to minimize the risk. Because that disease, whatever it is, if we think about it in the most simple possible terms, and this will go from bacterial diseases through for viral diseases, and ultimately even for our parasites that we're dealing with, is that there is a cycle that goes on there, and that pathogen, be that a worm, be that a virus, be that a bacteria, has to get entry into the animal, and that will come in through a lot of the diseases we're dealing with are sort of fecal oral contamination. So if we think about watery mouth, if we think about yonis, if we think about actually a lot of our parasites, they're coming in sort of from fecal contamination of what the animals are eating. They're then, once they're in the body, they're then replicating. And we may or may not see disease at that stage. So yonis, as I say, will potentially replicate and sort of actually we won't see disease for a much longer period of time. Parasites will sort of, we all know and are well aware of how rapidly those can go through and cause sort of that the cycle of replication there. And then those organisms ultimately, they're designed, it's all about how do they survive as pathogens. So it's again, they're going into the sheep or the lamb as its host, but they're going in there to replicate, and then success for them looks at, right, how do I get out of this one animal and get into another animal? It's a sort of, if I'm sort of, it's that movement. So once they then exit, it's then thinking about, right, they're going to go into that environment, and it's how do they persist in that environment? And it's thinking about how do I control that environmental persistence? So what am I doing in terms of cleaning sheds out? Because we all know the challenges that we have with lambing, where you know what, best will in the world, you go into a very clean shed at the start of lambing and everything goes relatively well. You have the sort of few blips with those sort of early lambers and things like that, and those are ones that we just start getting going, but they're lambing into a clean environment, so we don't see as much issues with sort of certainly lamb mortalities around sort of watery mouth and those kind of diseases. But as we go through a couple of weeks, 3 weeks or whatever of your lambing period, suddenly we're building and building to the pathogen load in that shed, and it's the procedures that we had in place right at the beginning in terms of our colostrum management and sort of what we're doing, they may not change over that 3 weeks, and actually we're still doing exactly the same thing in the sort of colostrum management, but because we've got that load build up in the environment, we are more likely to see disease. So we've got this constant cycle going on, and depending on the pathogens that we're talking about or what we're trying to do, if we're trying to improve efficiency, what are we going to do? For some of them, we might use vaccination. For others, it may be thinking about separating animals based on those risk of infection. So, right, actually, if we are isolating animals that we know have mastitis, so that we are keeping them away from other potential animals within the flock, that actually what we then do is go, okay, we are breaking that cycle. We're starting to stop that transmission from one animal to another. Quarantine is the big thing, and you'll all be aware of sort of the policies around that in terms of thinking about how do you control infectious foot rot coming in, things like also you're sort of thinking about your wormer resistance as well. So what you do in terms of rather than just bring it in and sort of suddenly unleash it on your population is thinking about, right, well, actually, I want to clear that out before it gets into my flock, control of vectors and sort of flies, and thinking about sort of cleaning and disinfection, but also being aware of the role that you potentially play in it. So that sort of what are you doing in terms of your boots transmitting things, sort of other people transmitting things. So if you've got shearers coming in, what are they doing in terms of sort of biosecurity there, or sort of as they work with your animals, and the overall good husbandry piece sits in there in terms of immunity. And ultimately that hygiene and biosecurity is always going to be important, so bear that in mind. And I think we sort of it is a key step. It does require time, effort, and commitment, and you having set protocols for things I think is really important. I'm getting old enough now that I can sit there and berate my my learnings as a student and what I was look back on and what we were taught at college. And ultimately, if I look back on what I was taught at college, and hey, if I was looking at controlling some of the infectious diseases, hey, cleanse and disinfect was the one word, well, 3-word answer that you gave at the end of a multiple question, and you got 1 mark for it. Whereas actually, and we then become guilty of putting cleanse and disinfect into a flock health plan or something like that. And actually, it's a process. It's a full process that you know people need full details there of exactly what that means, because it is about going, right, what am I doing? I'm taking away all the sort of organic matter, I'm properly cleaning it. I need to choose the right disinfectant because not all of them are equal. It's about thinking about, right, what bacteria, viruses, parasites in particular. So thinking about coccidiosis control, it is making sure that actually we are addressing those, and sort of the disinfectant is going to be effective about that. We're using it the right concentration, and then that shed is given enough time to dry out. And ultimately with lambing sheds, we do have this sort of seasonal use of the sheds, which is great. You do have that break there, but it's making sure that ultimately you do give yourself enough time prior to the start of lambing to have that shed properly emptied out and sort of cleaned out prior to just going into it. Because of the number of sheds that we go around, and sort of you'll see it's like it's the job that gets put off in some areas where you just turn around and go, right, we have a few animals that lambing shed gets used as a sort of the sick pen. We just have a few animals that go in there throughout the year or whatever, and then we get to lambing and suddenly there's a rush on. The weather changes, we bring animals into a dirty environment, and suddenly we haven't got off to the best start that we potentially could have done. So we highlighted in terms of the sort of the efficiency piece, and when we started this talk and talking about sustainability, it's all about us thinking about how do we improve the efficiency of the systems. And ultimately, if we compare sheep to other species that we deal with, their gestation period is not that long, but ultimately because of their limited breeding opportunities, they have a relatively sort of unproductive year. And certainly when we compare them to chickens or pigs, so that the sort of the opportunity there for genetic improvement is slightly lower. So we have to make sure that ultimately we are doing our best to sort of capitalize on what we can do in terms of that genetic improvement. We don't have the opportunity of having multiple sort of litters a year, and so it is going to take us longer to see that. So it's essential that we optimize reproductive performance to ensure productivity and the overall efficiency, which is going to be that key thing when we start considering sustainability. And reduced fertility rates may result from various different management factors, and they can affect both the male and the female. And I think that's one of the areas that we certainly see as vets coming through, is occasionally the sort of the male gets a bit overlooked or whatever, and it's making sure that there's 2 halves to every story, and making sure that you're addressing both of them is key. And ultimately, ewes may fail to become pregnant because they're not mated. So that could be down to an issue with the ram. It could be down to an issue with the fact that they're unhealthy at the time of of the breeding season. They may fail to become pregnant because they're unable to conceive after mating or AI, and that could be sort of again nutritional, could be disease related, or they may not maintain that pregnancy. And they may not be mated for a number of reasons, as I said. They may be an anestrus, poor body condition score, poor health conditions. the lambs, we've had a very sort of protracted period, and the lambs that use lamb too recently, or we've got the weaning sort of was very late. We may just not have that animal in a situation where it's ready to go again. Inadequate issues with the sort of libido with the male, too many females to the male, and so actually we just in that sort of physicality of them not being able to get round. We do have the potential for human error, so we do see it with synchronization errors, loss of sponges, challenges over the doses of ECG, and we then also, if we start considering what we're doing about bringing efficiencies through and considering our younger sort of replacements, if we're starting to think about breeding ewe lambs, they may not be mated because they just failed to reach the sort of required growth to accomplish a successful breeding. They may not conceive because ultimately the oocytes are poor quality semen in the ram, and again that's something that we can pick up with sort of making sure we think about getting our rams checked in good enough time and avoiding that panic where suddenly you have a ram that either hasn't performed during the season as you expect it to do, or it fails a test just before it was supposed to go in with the ewes. We may have pathology in the reproductive tract. There may be issues with stressors. So it's thinking about what you're doing around management procedures with those animals. And again, we may have errors in the synchronization program, so sort of issues with hormones, errors with our AI timing, things like that may ultimately result in that animal not conceiving. I mentioned in the last slide sort of ultimately that breeding from ewe lambs, and I think this is something to consider it in terms of us driving that efficiency piece. It goes alongside us trying to think about how many animals are we actually carrying on the farm. So if we can ewe lambs and get them back in lamb, and we can make use of those, and we're not sort of ultimately carrying them for a prolonged period. Ultimately, there is figures out there. So lambing ewe lambs could actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions generated per kilo of carcass meat by approximately 9.4%. So there is an opportunity, because we've sort of reduced that sort of number of almost inactive animals, so animals that we're just carrying in the flock, that helps us reduce emissions. But it's not without its challenges, but it does have rewards. So it could be there, and say with good husbandry, nutrition, and managed well, it does provide an opportunity for increasing sort of the financial gains from a system, and also like you sort of reducing that overall sort of number of breeding females that you're keeping, because you've effectively reduced that sort of that one layer within your flock that actually aren't having lambs at point. They do have lower fertility than mature ewes, but if you manage them well, ultimately it does allow you to get higher lifetime production. So it's that sort of we know that the first year may well not be as productive, but ultimately it does allow us to increase lifetime production. It does also think about it, if you think about it, if you're thinking about what you're going to breed through your flock, if we're thinking about us selecting for fertile animals and us thinking about identifying animals that aren't going to be problems in the future, us breeding in that first sort of opportunity, ultimately if we then have those animals that are barren after that, and assuming that our system is working well, we're growing them, and that there's nothing, we're not inherently bringing selecting factors in, actually it's a quick way of you identifying and selecting for your really fertile stock that then hopefully sort of you breed through, and those animals then become the more fertile sheep and ewes through the system. They do need to be managed as a separate group, and I suppose ultimately it's bearing in mind that they are still growing. So we do need to think about how you're going to make sure that you are ensuring they have sufficient feed to sustain that body growth, and ensure that we are still getting the fetus growth at wells, but then just balancing it with that kind of, ultimately we get to a point with it where we've grown them on, we've supported growth, but we then just need to make sure that ultimately we're not, as we go towards lambing and stuff like that, we're not overfeeding them so that we get lambs too big. Targets, I suppose it's sort of thinking about it, making sure that where those ewe lambs must be 60% of their mature body weight at tupping, and then sort of you're wanting to maintain a decent growth rate, and that's going to be your indicator of how we've got that animal. We're sustaining it. We still want it to be growing by about 250 grams a day post tupping, so we're still feeding that animal to grow. We don't want to sort of be that suddenly we've introduced an additional drain on the resources of that animal, there's additional drain in terms of energy that we're then not meeting with our nutrition. And most of you will already be using sort of body condition scoring, and that's an easy, as a good useful tool in terms of that indicator of where you're at. And there's guidance out there in terms of where you should be aiming for your animals. And I think making use of that data, thinking about how you sort of use this regularly to make sure that you are most efficiently managing the animals is key. And I think if you look at what we're doing in terms of that driving the sustainability, this isn't rocket science, and it is not new science in what we're talking about. This is about us thinking about what is it we do to how do I identify the animals that, hey, potentially needs additional feeding, or I'm identifying animals that actually I potentially am feeding more than required, so that I can actually reduce their intake, so put them on sort of tighter pasture, so that, or reduce the amount of supplementary feeding, because it's all about efficiency. This is what sustainability is. It's about, we can sit there talking about how we hey, we feed a supplement to reduce methane, or we do X, Y, and Z, but actually if we can reduce the amount of feed it takes to get an increased number of lambs on the ground that get to slaughter in a more efficient way, that is going to have the biggest impact in terms of what we do and how we do it. So think about what your targets are depending on your system. So for what you want your body condition to be, score to be, think about then if we are identifying animals that are over, that you are you're sort of thinking about how do I potentially limit stuff at certain stages. If they're under, it's whether what's going on there. Is there a challenge that we need to address, or is it a case that we just need to increase the plane of nutrition? And every year will be different, and the reasons behind it. And say you look at the rain that we've had recently, and it says that's has a big impact on sort of grass and what's going on, and absolutely, but this knowledge and the understanding of what's going on with your flock is a key step. So in some ways it's just identifying the fact that this piece here, that body condition scoring, and understanding how your flock is utilizing the nutrition that you present to it, is key to you understanding the sustainability piece. And don't lose sight of that, because we all come out with sort of new measures and things, and we're looking at everything and sort of more and more data, but actually this here, in terms of that sort of driving lamb growth, in terms of sort of birth weights for the lambs, the sort of actually the lamb survivability, and the sort of that sort of growth and sort of age at slaughter, is going to be a key piece. So don't underestimate the sort of things that you're already doing in terms of that sustainability piece, and providing you with the information for you to make decisions on, and informed choices. Because that nutrition is going to be, if we think about what one of the key areas that we want to improve is going to be in that lamb survival piece. That nutrition is that sort of that late pregnancy, where we've got about 70% of that sort of fetal growth occurring. So if you look at that graph, that sudden uptick very rapidly in terms of growth is sort of where we need to make sure that those animals are properly supported. We're getting the good udder development to provide the milk that they're required, and it's also the point at which we're producing the colostrum, and that colostrum intake, so that production and then that delivery of that colostrum into the animal itself, is going to be really really important. And we want to try and avoid too many changes in body condition score. So it is about that. It's you're balancing that sort of getting the information and acting on it. When it comes to colostrum, again, when we start talking about lamb survivability, if we were doing the same talking about calves, it's all going to be about the sort of colostrum, because if we don't get that right at the beginning, we're going to face an uphill battle in terms of sort of survivability. And we've seen the way that the industry has responded in a very positive manner to sort of the changes in terms of the antimicrobial usage. So the removal of products and such as Spectam, and sort of us relying, probably is the right word, on in some instances, on the use of antibiotics to get those animals over that sort of first challenge in terms of sort of poor hygiene and sort of disease challenge, and moving back towards lambing systems where we avoid needing that. Colostrum is a key part of that, and so it boils down to probably the sort of 3 Qs. So it's all about quantity, quality, and quickly. We have a limited window of during which that lamb is able to absorb the key immunoglobulins, so ultimately IgG, which is the key thing for ultimately we want that immunoglobulin to get into the bloodstream of the lamb. There are other immunoglobulins in colostrum which are ultimately will provide some surface protection, and the gut is open probably for the first sort of 24 hours. It closes down very rapidly. So we are at the situation where we need to get that colostrum into the lamb so that the immunoglobulins can pass through the gut into the bloodstream in a timely manner when it's required. If we miss that, we will still get some protection. So it's a sort of, if we were to take colostrum and continually feed it to lambs over 24 hours of age, you will see a benefit. It becomes a sort of, you're putting a barrier. Those immunoglobulins will sit on the surface of the gut, and they'll prevent some of the pathogens sort of adhering to the gut, but it's not going to be able to get into the into the bloodstream. So it becomes very short-lived. So you get this sort of really good surface protection for a short time, but ultimately you may see disease challenges later. So always concentrate on those 3 Qs. So in terms of what your target's then thinking about, is ultimately is thinking we want to get about 200 mils of colostrum within 2 hours of birth, and a sort of ultimately newborn lamb, we want it to get with that. If we think about it with that first 24 hours, probably I need 200 mils per kilo in that first 24 hours. So you're looking about getting a litre of colostrum in the first day of life. So that's what your targets need to be. And I realize that some of you will be lambing large numbers, and me turning around and saying, right, I need you to get 200 mils of colostrum into every lamb. You sitting there and doing that may not be possible. But sometimes if you're seeing increased disease issues, it may point to the fact that actually spending this time will be worthwhile, or you use it on a risk-based approach. We all know, if I was to ask the room, which lambs are less likely to get up and suckle immediately. So which ones are we more likely to find still lying down after 2 hours, or still being less sort of having problems? They are going to be the ones that we end up assisting, the ones that have a sort of a harder arrival into the world. You know what, the sort of that asphyxiation, the sort of the lack of oxygen they get will create challenges for them, so they're less likely to get up and suck. And similarly, we can visually identify any ewes that we know have got a bad bag, and that those lambs are going to struggle to hook onto it. So we could do it for everything. And you turn around and go, right, we are going to put in place policies that we are going to make sure we get colostrum into absolutely everything, and we're very militant about making sure everything's suckled within 2 hours. Or you do a risk-based approach, and you go, right, anything that I am lambing, anything I'm assisting, or ewes that I know have got a bad bag, actually spending time and putting colostrum into those, and whether that's stripping it off and getting into those lambs just by stomach tube, that couple of minutes to do that will potentially increase your numbers and your survivability quite dramatically. And then for those of you, oh, sorry,
Tim, can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Are all artificial substitutes equal, or are some better than others?
Yeah, and that's a really really good question, Katie. And I think all things aren't created equal. And I think the key thing to look at, what's the key part of colostrum? There are lots of supplements out there. And the supplements will generally be made, hey, they've got protein in them. They're often they're a good energy source. So there might be a lot of egg protein and things in them. They may have they sell themselves on a lot of vitamins and stuff like that. The key question to ask is what they have in terms of immunoglobulins themselves in them. And this is probably one of the, well, you definitely get what you pay for in this circumstance, in these circumstances. So the very, very cheap formulations will have very limited, if any, immunoglobulin, and so if it's labeled as a supplement, it may well just be an energy source to boost it, whereas there are products out there which will be slightly more costly, but actually have immunoglobulins in it. So that's the question to be asking. And you can measure your quality of colostrum. So targets are about, if you've seen the refractometer there, if you're interested in doing that. So we've talked about just ensuring that lambs get sufficient colostrum, and sort of making sure we take that step. But it could be a case that actually the quality of the colostrum isn't great. So if we've got thin ewes, if we've got ewes that have had mastitis, the colostrum quality, it may not be good as well. So we don't necessarily want to give that poorer quality colostrum. Something like there, the refractometer, you can pick up off Amazon for about 15 quid. You can measure that. You literally put a drop on the end under the sort of that clear flap, hold it up to the light, and you just get a reading off it. And if it's over 26.5, that's classified as good quality. To put in perspective, I think the studies that are out there at the moment, probably about 20% of ewes will have colostrum that isn't quite up to standard. And then if you're identifying those, as Katie alluded to, you may choose that you want to use a replacer and supplement it. You may want to go, right, you may have a stash of colostrum that you have saved from other ewes. And I think certainly if you're going that and you're freezing colostrum to have as storage, test the quality of it before it goes in the freezer, because then at least you know that you're saving the good stuff. There's nothing worse than putting poor quality colostrum in the freezer and then bringing that out. Or you can, we still have some people making use of cow's colostrum, but probably it is making sure that you are probably diluting that with multiple different animals, just to sort of avoid the potential chance of anemia and things. If you are collecting colostrum, please make sure you are doing it in a clean way. Label what you're storing, and store it in small amounts. Think about how much you're going to need. So putting it in a 5-litre ice cream tub that you're then going to have to chip at away, or is going to sit there and take a long time to defrost, is not going to what you want to be using when you're tired in the middle of lambing. So into Ziploc bags and doses that you can literally just reach as and when you need it is going to be much easier. Keep it clean, because hey, we could have the best quality colostrum in the world. If we leave it out, we just grows bacteria in it. Actually, we undo all the goodness that we're doing by giving it, because the last thing we want to do is give a dose of dirty bacteria loaded colostrum to those animals. So think
Tim,
about having
there's another question come in. With the target for far lower use of antibiotics, would now be a good time for the resurrection of Colivac? I've never heard of that one. Or some dead vaccine to promote colostrum efficacy.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. I think certainly what we see, we don't necessarily have it so much in the ewes and the sheep side. We certainly have an increased interest in this on the cattle side. So at the cattle side, we have vaccines there that we are giving to the sort of the cows in their sort of later stage of lactation and sort of in the dry period, that we are then boosting the quality of colostrum. So actually, yeah, there is a conversation to have with the manufacturers and bring back. But yeah, certainly anything that we can do to boost the quality of the colostrum is going to be positive. And yeah, the vaccines are one thing that we can do. The other thing we can do is making sure again that we are giving those what we're doing to those ewes in terms of their standard vaccinations will help in terms of sort of giving some protection against other diseases that we're concerned about, but also nutrition, making sure that we've got a good plane of nutrition, we're avoiding stress with those animals, is another way of sort of ensuring that we've got the best quality. Those 3 Qs, it's almost, again, it's like that tripartite that we showed up for disease. They all interact a little bit. If my colostrum is slightly poorer quality, if I give more of it, ultimately I can get the dose I need of the immunoglobulins. But it's a really good question, and certainly it's a good shout in terms of actually that would be the ideal thing, is if we could start getting to a point where we are vaccinating animals to really boost that quality. You then need to make sure that you're getting it into the lambs, and that's always going to be the key focus. So think about having a colostrum plan, and especially if you've got multiple people on the farm, think about, right, what are you doing in terms of what do you have in terms of fresh or frozen colostrum? Are you checking the quality of it? When are you intervening? When are we giving that colostrum? Because if you're going to take steps to give colostrum to lambs, it's going to be much better given quickly. So trying to work out how you do that, how you prioritize that, what you're doing in terms of making sure your stomach tubes you're clean, your dosing equipment is clean, because it's the classic thing we see in any neonatal animals, and we see it in calves quite a lot, is that it's what are you doing, especially when you're busy, to keep your feeding equipment clean. So we have the animals in that newborn lamb that has no immunity of its own. We then have a stomach tube, and if you've got multiple stomach tubes, it's keeping them clean, because what you don't want it to be doing is have that stomach tube that you've used to stomach tube a sick lamb, or that's already got watery mouth or whatever, and you're taking that back and then sticking it straight into a newborn lamb. So thinking about, right, how am I keeping these tubes clean? Because at that stage, you almost suddenly, it becomes a snowball. We are doing the right thing in terms of sort of protecting for disease, but actually you're inadvertently, you are acting as that kind of major potential for transferring it as well. So think about having a plan. And ultimately, how else can we think about improving lamb survival? Say we want that environment clean. We want that, so we focus on that sort of body condition soil, making sure that dam has a good colostrum supply. The lamb gets sufficient colostrum, and then making sure that we're doing the basics right. So thinking about dressing navels and things like that. Other things that can impact, and as I say, this was highlighted as part of one of the priorities for the health and welfare pathways, ultimately mastitis. It costs the sheep industry about, more than 120 million per year, both in direct and indirect costs. So that's going to be actually loss of production, loss of impact in terms of growth rates, and then also the sort of the costs of management and treatment of it. So because that reduced milk production will lead to lower growth rates of suckling lambs, and ultimately is going to impact on your bottom line and profitability. If you look across the country, reported incidence of clinical mastitis ranges from about, there'll be some farms that say they don't have any at all, and up to about 6.6% per year. And where you have a ewe with mastitis, it is contagious, and it will, when we think about that biosecurity piece, if it's in your flock, it's thinking about, how do I stop this spreading from one animal to another? And that could be through cross suckling, that could be through equipment that you're using, or just from the point of being that environmental contamination. Symptoms are, we'll all be aware of those, but think it's sort of looking out for heat and swelling, pain in the udder, so that lamb's not necessarily being allowed to feed. You may appear lame, so we occasionally see that sort of those animals that look slightly jaunty on their sort of their hind limbs and sort of how they're walking may actually have mastitis, because it's a painful condition. Depending on the bacteria, we may sort of start seeing that actually that udder becomes cold and gangrenous, and we see potentially changes in the milk and that sort of intramammary masses. In terms of control, that again, it's thinking about, how do we control that environment to make sure it's clean and we reduce it. So we want to make sure that we're boosting the immunity of the animals, so that it's been shown that if the animals are underfed, low body condition score, they're going to be more at chance of mastitis. So think about what you could be doing for providing extra supplementation for thin ewes and old ewes, so that we are boosting them up. It's the same way that we would potentially increase feeding of younger animals and during cold periods. It's ultimately, if we provide more energy, that's going to help provide them the building blocks that they need for ensuring that their immunity is where we want it to be. Think about building that sort of check of the udder when you are going in, and sort of, if you're assisting lambings and you're doing that, have a check of the udder. Use that as one of your screening tools, because I think sometimes, especially if we're thinking about longer term, when we think about efficiencies, we'll talk about cull rates in a bit. It's about, how do I make sure that I'm making the right decision? So palpating udders, it's not just always going to be very visible. It may be the fact that you sort of palpate lumps and you see that there. trying to control the spread, so separating ewes with mastitis from the rest of the flock. Trying to think about, right, if we're lambing outside, what are we doing in terms of sort of providing protection from the weather? How are we keeping the environment clean and sort of reducing that spread? And sort of also thinking about it, it's at the other end as well. So we need the good nutrition to develop the milk, develop the udder, get the colostrum. But when we start weaning, suddenly we're at another risk period there, where suddenly we're taking an animal off of you that actually potentially we've then got this period where it's still producing a lot of milk, and that can then produce another risk factor. So what are you doing at that stage to sort of think about reducing post weaning? And it's also thinking about building it in, as I say, with your culling policy. So previous cases, right, that almost should go onto your cull list to sort of reduce that risk of disease. But thinking about, hey, are there animals there that we know are going to be more susceptible? So animals with very poor udder conformation, distended teats, those kind of things that actually are going to leave them much more likely to have disease challenges in the future. And as we move forward, where do we get to with regards focusing things? So thinking about, if we're thinking about efficiencies and what we are trying to achieve, if we go back to what this presentation is all about, is that sustainability. How do I reduce the impact of my farming systems on the environment? It's all about how do I get things through with best use of resources, with as little inputs as possible, so that we can actually, and we get the maximum out of it. So we need to be focusing on things like growth rates in our lambs, and this sort of table sort of just illustrates that. I think if we are getting to a point at the end, hey, we're weaning at about 20 kilos, if we're it's simple maths. If we're only gaining 100 grams a day, it's going to take a lot longer for those animals to get up to slaughter, in terms of actually, yes, they may be eating less during those days, but actually that extended period that we're feeding them for means that we are sort of getting very inefficient, and it's a sort of, that has an impact on your bottom line, but it also has an impact on the sort of sustainability of the piece. It also, think about, it's just sort of, how do we make our systems more profitable? And you look at that sort of the sort of the example there, in terms of actually the sort of dry matter that actually is required to get that, it's a huge difference between in terms of feed efficiency. So if we are monitoring our growth rates, we have an idea of where we're at, we can start think about your targets. And 300 grams per day is a relatively easy target to hit. It's not looking at its extreme targets there. So having an idea of what you're trying to achieve is really important. And if we are looking at that kind of animal that we've got weight loss, or failure to gain weight, or failure to thrive, I suppose it's starting to ask some key questions. And this flowchart, I suppose, probably it sits in this weird area where it's sort of, this is how I would approach it from a veterinary point of view, but it's the same thing for you. It's starting to think about asking the questions of your system. What is going on? And so what are the likely causes? Because that then allows you to start being more targeted. Because if we literally just go, right, my lambs aren't gaining weight, it's to sort of go, right, there's so many factors it could be. But asking a few questions suddenly gets us down to the fact we start narrowing it down a bit more targeted. So actually, if you start looking at it and go, right, we've got the flock's losing weight, or we've got a group of lambs failing, like, is it the whole batch? Because if it's the whole batch, you know what, it's going to be much more likely to be sort of something that's affecting all of them. So, hey, nutrition, or some of the diseases that we know are going to be spread much more across all of them. So that we may see issues with things like parasites and stuff like that. That's much more likely to affect a large group. If it's only odd animals, that's more likely to be down to the fact that actually, and certainly when we're dealing with older animals that are failing to thrive, not gaining weight, they're losing body condition, that's more likely to be an individual variation. So that's going to be things like lameness. Oh yeah, we may have large numbers of lame animals, but ultimately it's still it's an individual thing. Or the same thing where we've got issues with dental disease. So it's thinking about, right, how do I start thinking about targeting the problems that I may have? And one of the questions to ask yourself is like, right, if they're not performing, are they actually eating? So is their appetite normal? Because if it is, then actually it's then thinking about, right, is the nutrition adequate? If it's not, we then need to think about what do we do, and that may be down to changes in pasture and availability due to the seasonality, but it could also be down to issues with things like trace element deficiencies. If the nutrition is good and we've done the analysis and we've got the grass is where we think it's going to be, or whatever forage we're feeding is exactly where we need it to be, then actually we're then looking at an issue where actually the animal's just not able to make use of what we're putting in front of it or what it's taking in. So we've got an issue with sort of malabsorption, maldigestion. And then we start thinking again, that sort of points us down the line of it being parasites. So we start thinking, all right, we need to think about our parasite control, think about diseases such as Johne's and sort of more individual things like tumors. On the flip side, if we then got an animal that won't eat, putting the best quality food in front of it, actually, if the appetite's not there, we're not going to get the impact that we need. And so things that are going to impact on its appetite, so parasites again will potentially reduce its appetite. But we also may have an animal that is physically unable to eat because that may be down to challenges around its teeth, so broken mouths, or if we've got severe lameness. So you can instantly see how we start sort of, if we think about our systems, it's about how can I look at my system, looking at, none of this takes a huge amount of data. It doesn't take a huge amount of diagnostics to start doing it. It's getting you to think about, right, where my priorities are. And yes, it may point to the fact that actually I need to get some my silage analysis. I need to do my grass analysis so that I need know where I'm at in terms of nutrition. I may need to look at my parasite control. So I might want to run some fecal egg counts. But it allows you to start thinking about, right, if I'm going to spend money, where am I going to do it in a targeted way? But it's also about how can I make my system really efficient. Body condition score comes in again post lambing, and again, I'm not going to go through all the different targets, but it's thinking about, right, having that knowledge allows you to be targeted. We know that ultimately each year is going to be different in terms of the grazing and what the grass is like. So we have to be proactive in terms of it and thinking about, right, are we losing body condition score, in terms of, in which case do we need to think about at what stage do we wean, take those lambs off, think about what the grass availability is for them, or what we do in terms of supplementary feeding to balance that. And it will be, one year will always be different to another. And I think certainly when we're thinking about efficiencies, being that that ability to be nimble, you having the information there to be targeted about it, will help your efficiencies and sort of help you sort of be targeted about what inputs you're putting in. Because actually, hey, if you can get around with the grass is good and we're not having to feed thing, and we can get we're not losing too much body condition scores off the ewes, hey, that's great. We can get as much growth as we possibly can, and we speed up that process to slaughter. But ultimately we also need to balance it by, we don't want those animals, the ewes, to lose so much condition that then we're going to struggle to, we're then carrying a headache as we then go on as we go through the cycle again. Because it is remembering that ultimately, yes, we have a sort of, we do have a force period when we're not breeding those animals, but it's a relatively short period if we start building in the fact that how long it takes for an animal to add a body condition score on. Because if we think a body condition score equates to about 12% of a mature ewe's body weight, it's going to take, hey, if we're looking at a 70 kilo ewe, that's about 8 kilos. So even if we're looking at a gain of in the sort of 100 gram per day, for it to put that weight back on, it's going to take best part of 2 months to do it. So if we've lost a huge amount of condition, it's a long time. It takes us a while for us to get that back onto that ewe to get it ready for the next cycle. So it is, again, it's always sort of thinking we are looking after what we're doing now, but it's also having the data there to think about the future as well. Parasite control, as I said at the beginning, it's a sort of, this is a, hey, we could do an entire course on parasite control. So I think I'm going to gloss over this very rapidly because I think it's we just don't have time to cover it. But it is thinking about how this needs to be sustainable as well. And the industry's done a great job in terms of how we get targeted and that the responsible use of our the products available to us. But we have to be conscious that ultimately these parasites will have a negative impact on animals' ability to use the feed that they're presented with. So we do need to have control strategies in place, and we need to be proactively monitoring it. So because ultimately those parasite burdens, even in the absence of clinical disease, can result in decreased productivity and economic losses. So monitoring, targeted will depend on your systems, what you've got in terms of grazing, and you'll be sort of that risk-based approach to it. And it's also thinking about, right, within that, work with your SQPs, work with your vets to make sure that you are using the right products at the right time, giving to the right animals and administered in the right way. We see that it's still that the principles put forward by SCOPS are still very much at the forefront of what the animal health and welfare pathway is doing, because they're trying to look into that resistance piece. And so if you've got queries about what's going on with your anthelmintic use on farm, making use of those funding availability, the money that's available there for testing, will provide you with useful advice as to how to go forward with best on this front. And other diseases to consider, things like a sheep scab, and it's a sort of, it's the classic one in terms of what are you doing in terms of that. If we think back to that cycle about how am I ensuring that I'm protecting my flock, what am I doing in terms of animals coming in, screening them. It's a disease that we're not instantly going to see signs of, and by the time that if you buy animals in and you haven't screened for it, like by the time it actually shows clinical signs, 60% of the flock could be affected. So think about, if you are buying animals in, what you're doing in terms of quarantine, screening for it. But again, it's also about making sure that be wary of blanket treatments just on the off chance of something. Ultimately, there is scab will cause itchiness and sort of loss of wool, but that could also be caused by other things. And so if we are there trying to maintain the sustainability of us, sustainability is not just, it's all about, hey, we can talk about carbon, but we can also talk about us sustaining the products available to us, so making sure our anthelmintics are still worthwhile. What steps are we doing to make sure we drive down resistance and the potential for that, the emergence of that resistance as well. Again, lameness will sit there as a major issue that we need to be considering, and will have an impact on the efficiencies of our systems. So think about what you're doing to control lameness in your flocks, because if we've got lame animals, we have challenges over what they're going to be consuming. So they're going to make worse use of ultimately the pastures in front of them or the nutrition we provide. So suddenly we can have everything right in terms of the production cycles on the farm, in terms of what we're doing to produce the feed that we are producing and to give to our animals. But if we're then having to use more of it because it's less efficient and the animals are not utilizing it in the best possible way, suddenly we undo all the progress that we make in terms of our sustainable practices elsewhere. So think about that 5-point plan for lameness. So thinking about culling out sort of potential poorer animals or animals that are affected, quarantining to that biosecurity piece. Think about how you reduce the impact of animals coming in, treating promptly, getting on top of disease, and that goes for any diseases that we deal with, and how do we avoid infection, and then potentially build in vaccination as well. Disease just to think about in terms of some of the ones that I think probably sometimes are less on people's radar. I suppose I think it's the sort of diseases like Johne's are sort of coming to a fore a bit more, and sort of things to think about if you are seeing animals that are losing conditions and poorer performance. It does have a very long incubation period, and there's no cure, and it's ultimately fatal. And I think sometimes it's that sort of one that these animals are often, these will be the animals that may get culled out for other reasons, and certainly we see this with in the dairy herds, is that actually the Johne's, if we were to screen all the culls that go through, the proportion of those that are actually affected for Johne's is much higher than the general population, because it's almost this disease that sort of sits alongside and makes things more likely to be culled for other reasons. Not typically seen as sort of animals 3 to 4 years of age and older, chronic weight loss, poor fleece, scouring. We don't see as much scouring as we do in cattle, but is potential there, or bottle jaw, so associated with that protein loss. This again is a classic disease that we see in terms of sort of that ingestion of feces. So if we're thinking about what do we do as a whole to our flock to make sure that we are maximizing the potential health and sort of minimizing disease things, highest standard of possible hygiene will help control diseases such as this. It is an infection that can be spread by other species, so wildlife. It can be spread also by cattle and things like that. So it is something to to be aware of, and especially if you're doing any kind of co-grazing. And so if you're co-grazing, it is one of those risk factors that ultimately certainly younger lambs are potentially more at risk of it picking it up from co-grazing than the older sheep. They're less likely to have a problem with it if they're sort of older animals, but certainly young lambs going on to co-grazed ground that's been previously grazed by an infected cattle can be a problem. One last disease I just wanted to highlight, and I suppose it's just keeping it extremely topical. Hopefully you all are all aware that we have identified blue tongue in the country. This is a disease that is not normally here. We had last outbreak we had was 2007, I think, was when we last had a major outbreak of it, but unfortunately this was identified last month, and as of the 5th of December, they have identified 7 cases within the UK. Still very much concentrated over in the southeast, sort of around Kent and sort of Canterbury area, but it's something to bear in mind. I suppose on a positive front, we are going into sort of the colder winter, so the sort of the vectors that would normally that we require for transmission, so the midges, are potentially going to die out, so it potentially will limit the spread, but I think it is something to be aware of. We did see it sort of spread much more widely last time we had an outbreak in the UK. There are lots of different serotypes of blue tongue. So before you ask, ultimately, unfortunately, whereas last time we did have vaccines available for the specific serotypes that came into the UK, currently we do not have vaccines available for this serotype. So there isn't a vaccine available. Signs to be looking out for, ultimately ulcers or sores in the mouth and nose, discharge from the eyes or nose, drooling from the mouth, swelling of the lips, tongue, head and neck, and also swelling around the feet. Other clinical signs, red skin as a result of sort of it sort of pulls beneath, so it looks like there's sort of you've got that redness and sort of fever, lameness, again associated with the lesions that you see around the feet, potentially breathing problems, but they would sit alongside that swelling of the lips and tongue. It can cause abortions, and it can be fatal as well. So you may just see mortalities with it. If you are suspicious of this, or you're seeing anything that you're unsure about, encourage you to speak to your local vet, or certainly if you are at a stage where you definitely think that you have got something that you're worried about, you are legally obliged to, if you suspect blue tongue, to report it. The numbers are there. Ultimately, if you sort of search online, you'd also come through just in terms of reporting it through to DEFRA, and they would then investigate, or they'd go through a triage process with you to investigate. So not being there scaremongering, but I think it's important that sometimes we just sort of highlight that this is out there. There is that potential, and it's sort of making sure that you are on the lookout for it. And as we get to the end, I suppose one of the things to think about in terms of efficiency ultimately is culling. Think about what you are doing in terms of carrying through animals that are non-productive. And it always seems a bit callous, but I think when we start talking about efficiencies and what we do in terms of improving our sustainability and also our sort of financial performance, it's thinking about, right, how many animals are we carrying that potentially are not necessarily earning, or they are not necessarily, or they're actually just costing us money. So think about making sure that you are only retaining ewes that are going to be fit for breeding, because that's going to be a key piece. So no ewe should be kept if she's unlikely to rear lambs in the next season, and bringing in that sort of getting rid of those provides you that opportunity to bringing better stock to raise performance. That's either through purchased animals or through providing sort of slots for your ewe lambs to come through. And I think when we look at the successful programs for this, good records are essential, and I think it's having a good record system, or just having a tagging system that when you go through lambing, that you are tagging ones that have got bad bags, poor mothers, ringworm, those kind of things. That ultimately you at that point record those animals that, you know what, next year I want those to have gone. I don't want them to lamb again, so that you've got an easy process where you can go through and get your culling decisions and make them through. And so if we look at the UK situation, probably the 6 main reasons for culling: body condition score, we've mentioned that as we've gone through today's presentation. So thinking about animals that aren't at where we want them to be or are failing to achieve that, even though through intervention, bad udders and sort of issues with mastitis, getting rid of that, for not being able to feed and support the lambs, but also reducing that potential risk for disease. Reproductive performance, it's all about efficiency at the end of the day. Teeth, so not able to put on weight, feet and lameness, and then sort of also that capturing that information about lambing ease and sort of mothering ability. So in summary, I hope we've taken you on a bit of a sort of big jaunt through the lambing year. I hope we sort of covered and we've given you some useful tidbits as to sort of things to be thinking about. It's a slightly different approach to sort of the sustainability, but I think the key thing here was to focus on the fact that animal health, much as a sort of it does have a huge impact on the sustainability measures of your enterprises, both in profitability but also in terms of environmental impact. And if we can make our systems more efficient, so we can get the same amount of product out of the a smaller number of animals, or we can with a same amount of product with less inputs, ultimately we are going to drive down those other factors that we are considering as part of the sustainability sort of measures on farm. So at that point, I will end there. Happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, hope it's been useful.
Has anyone got any questions? If you have, you can obviously just unmute yourself and ask a question, or put your hand up, or type it in the chat box, whichever you'd like. Crosby looks like he's going to speak. Carry on, Crosby.
Yeah, straight into the money side, vaccinations. The question simply being for Enzovac and Toxo and FootVac, would we get away with doing the hoggets or doing the ewe lambs for the first couple of years and not doing the rest of the flock?
So I have to, without knowing your exact risk factors on your farm, it's
25, 30, 40 years of sheep only.
Yeah, and I think I have to be very, and I say I'm not trying to be obtuse about it, Crosby. It's more about me. Is this, from my point of view, it's a conversation to have with your vet as to terms of what you're seeing in terms of your abortions. There's always going to be a risk if you drop some of them off, but ultimately those which animals are going to have lower exposure to disease, yeah, absolutely, your younger animals. So those, if we look at that, is they're always going to be that sort of, those are the ones that we probably need to definitely focus on for injections. But there is going to be benefit from boostering them as well. So it's going to be it's a risk and reward situation, but I would encourage you to have a conversation with your vet about it and look at what goes on there.
Yeah, I would say the FootVac, we had too many lame lambs and too many lame ewes. We did do that 3 years ago. It was really good, cleared the whole flock up. We ended up housing lambs, and even the lambs coming into the house weren't going lame, so I was well pleased with that. But it is quite expensive at £1 or even £2 first time round. So since then, we have only done the younger ones, and touch wood, it has still been working. I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah, okay. And I think, as you say, you've seen a benefit from it, and I think it is about it's getting to that sustainability. The risk is, and we do see this where vaccines are, hey, we do run the risk, and I see with this clients, you go, oh yeah, I haven't seen disease for the last while, and part of that is because you are vaccinating, and it's then turning around and go, it's taking it out, is suddenly you go, if that undoes everything that you've already done. And that's not me sitting there as the person that would provide you vaccines, but you undo it, and then suddenly you get that sort of push back up in terms of disease, and actually the cost saving disappears. So it's being very careful about taking stuff out.
Yeah, I think possibly a big plus would be the fact that we've managed to keep a closed flock with only bringing in rams. That has been the advantage.
And I think absolutely, and I think when you look at the 5 point for lameness, especially, that vaccine part is part of that whole piece. So there will be situations where, if you look at what you're doing, if you have managed to reduce the challenge in the environment, that ultimately the vaccines helped you get on top of control of it, but it may be a case, and we certainly see that with some diseases, where we get to a stage where you go, okay, well, actually, if I've eradicated this disease and I'm no longer running the risk of bringing it in, am I at the stage where I can then start phasing things out? But I would do that in a very structured way, and I would consult your vet on that.
Thank you.
Has anybody else got any questions? I think Ian had unmuted at one point, so I don't know whether, have you got a question, Ian?
Yeah, it was just on the one point that you'd said about the ewe lambs. Lifetime production improved by lambing the ewe lambs in the first year, because we've always historically not lambed them and run them. And I always thought, well, I'd rather have a good ewe run another year at the back end as opposed to try and lamb one at the early end, where you're only going to get maybe one lamb. Hopefully, before she culls, you get two lambs at that. So you say it doesn't work that way. You don't push that ewe. She won't survive any longer.
No, and I think that's ultimately that if managed well and you get the nutrition right, and we continue to growing through, what you almost do is you're doing it both ends. So ultimately, if we look at it, you should get that lamb in that first season, but ultimately, it, as you say, if it doesn't work and it doesn't add up efficiency wise, if she only then lasts X number of seasons. So ultimately, there is no reason why. Hopefully, what you do is that you're bringing that younger animal in, you manage her, she gets that lamb under her belt effectively, but we also expect her to go on just as long as you're currently seeing. So we're not expecting her to fall off at the end. Does that make sense? Because I think yeah, you're right. You're rightly saying, all right, I missed this one, but I get two lambs longer term. It's actually this way, hopefully we get to the stage where we're almost getting two bites at the apple. We get that first lamb, but actually we want her to go on just to the same age at the end of the day. It's being culling at the aim of age, not on ultimately the number of seasons she's done.
And I think also, just to add something else into that, is when she first lambs as a yearling, that's the first time she's producing that udder tissue, and actually you then expect her, if that's the first time she's lambed, to then rear two, but actually it's the first time she's developing that udder tissue to milk. So if she's lambed as a ewe lamb and she's already developed that udder tissue, I think they milk better as a yearling if they've had that process of developing the udder tissue at a younger age. Yeah, there is some studies been out, or there's still studies going on with challenge sheep. They were following sheep over a 7-year period. I think they're in year 7 now, so I don't know what results have come out of that. That was an AHDB study, but they're in year 7, so they're following the ewe lambs from lambing them as ewe lambs on quite a lot of different flocks across the country. So there should be information on that might be interested to you, Ian.
Fantastic.
John?
Thank you.
You just need to unmute yourself, John. There we go.
Yep. So I suppose just in terms of driving down, carbon footprint, meeting emissions, surely, and I know it doesn't apply to in every situation, every farm's different, but if you can lamb your ewe lambs, that's, you're not carrying any passengers. So every sheep you have effectively is a productive animal on the farm.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's where that sort of 9.4 percentage comes in. Is it suddenly we are bringing, we're not carrying additional head count that are less efficient. And as Katie said, some of this is about us allowing those animals to develop in a stepwise process rather than throwing them in expecting them to have two lambs. And sort of we see it in the sort of in the dairy, when you start looking at dairy heifers, if we take them too far before they have their first calf, actually the udder development or the fat that gets laid down actually we're almost trying to use that early pregnancy as a way of developing and driving the tissue development that we want, rather than sort of the tissue development that potentially can happen, which actually is less desirable.
Has anybody else got any more questions? Don't think there's any more questions. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. If anyone has got questions, obviously you've got your own vets to ask, or send something in, I'm sure I can send it on to Tim and he wouldn't mind answering that. But thank you very much for all spending your evening this evening to join us, and I will send it out, the recording, afterwards once we've got it all sorted. So if there is anything you need to go back and just recap on, then you'll be able to do that at a later date. But thank you very much everyone for joining us this evening, and if you want to join any of the grassland and soil meetings throughout January, just let me know and I'll obviously add you to the list. I know some of you are already signed up to those, but just ping me an email and I can get you signed up to those for the new year. Thank you very much everybody. Have a good rest of your evening.
Kelly.
No worries. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.